Frankie Lymon and Zola Taylor, the duo that never was. Frankie Lymon and Zola Taylor were the shining stars of their respective groups. Frankie, the electrifying voice of the Teenagers, and Zola, the only female member of the legendary Platters. Their paths first crossed backstage at the Apollo Theater in 1956, sparking a connection that would grow into an on-again, off-again relationship spanning for nearly a decade. It was a union marked by passion, turbulence, and the weight of fame. Zola Taylor. We hit it off right away. It was a magic touch. The two definitely had chemistry, but they weren't exclusive. As their personal lives intertwined, their professional paths began to take shape. Zola would remain with the Platters until the early 60s, later leading her own version of the group alongside fellow member Paul Robbie, and Frankie continued with the Teenagers until his departure from the group in 1957. Following his split from the group, Frankie launched a solo career, and it was off to a good start with the song Goody Goody, which was first released as Frankie Lymon and the Teenagers, and later changed to just Frankie Lymon. Frankie Lymon. I cut Ella Fitzgerald's old song Goody Goody on my own without the group, and it sold 1 million copies. Money was rolling in for a while. In 1958, Frankie was at his peak as a solo artist, but without the Teenagers, he was isolated and left to navigate a ruthless industry on his own. Herman Santiago. Frankie didn't want to leave the group. It was someone else's decision. Frankie's first wife, Elizabeth Waters. Well, another thing I think really threw him was the tension and dissension between him and the Teenagers. I think Roulette Records had put the pressure on Bob Redcross to let the Teenagers know they had to split up. They didn't want the Teenagers anymore, and that's who Frankie had started out with. Of course, that kept a real bad thing while they were together. The Teenagers didn't know where they were going to go, and they knew they only wanted Frankie. So I think that really bothered him. Jimmy Merchant. We spent a lot of years being angry at Frankie, but it wasn't his fault. It was management. It was a marketing decision to make him a Sammy Davis Jr., to make him a Frank Sinatra, and just throwing the four of us away. And it certainly looked that way as their manager not only split Frankie from the group, but he also stood in the way of the Teenagers when they tried to continue without him. Sherman Garnes. We tried, but nothing happened after that. We had 8 records, but our manager wouldn't release them because he was also managing Frankie Lymon. He wanted to down us and push Frankie up. We had no one to turn to. Jimmy Merchant. I sometimes wondered if Frankie told his mom he didn't want to leave our group, even though he and everyone else knew he was an outstanding star performer. Years later, I learned that riding the subway back and forth daily to record his solo records downtown bothered him at times, even as his mother insisted that he go. However, Frankie would say, "My mother doesn't like me being around so many adults by myself, but she has nothing to worry about. I can handle it." But he couldn't. In fact, not long after that statement, Frankie was introduced to heroin by a woman who was more than twice his age, and according to the man who would later become Frankie's manager, Sam Bray, that woman was a well-known name in show business. Frankie Lymon. I never intended to get hooked on dope. I knew it was bad, and at first I was content just to skin pop, but soon I got daring, and it wasn't long before I was injecting the stuff right into my veins. Elizabeth Waters. He had no real family relationships. He traveled all over the world, 13 years old, with no real chaperone. Following the success of Goody Goody, Frankie went through a dry spell, and his next big record wouldn't come until 1960, with the release of Little Bitty Pretty One, which was recorded in 1958, but by the time it was released, his voice had changed, and he no longer had the voice that everyone knew and loved. And although he was still an excellent singer and fantastic performer, no longer having his signature voice and the fact that he was now an addict led to the industry no longer wanting him. Richard Barrett of the Valentines. His voice is changing. Nobody wanted to develop the change of the voice of the young kid to the young man to the grown man. Nobody wanted to go through that transition with him. Elizabeth Waters. His problem was his voice changed. He had a good voice, but it wasn't the high voice that made the money, so he had to change up and start singing other types of songs. Jimmy Merchant. Frankie's voice was so high. We're talking about a 12-year-old kid. That's how old he was when we recorded Why Do Fools Fall in Love. You can't get a man to do a 12-year-old's part. And if you do find a man who could hit those notes, I don't know how long it could last. In 1961, Frankie released I Put the Bomp and Young. And in I Put the Bomp, Frankie opened it the same way he did on Why Do Fools Fall in Love. But he was far from the teenage sensation who, at just 13, had topped the charts. The fame had come fast and faded just as quickly. But in the 60s, a different Frankie emerged. One older, more seasoned, yet still carrying an incredible voice. This was not the same boy who sang to screaming crowds in 1956. This was a young man, searching for a new place in the world with his new sound. Frankie Lymon. I want to lose the rock and roll image. I've grown up, I think. I watched the kids who sang rock and roll. They were snatched out of school because of a hit record. When the success blew over, they didn't even have a high school diploma. Now they're driving trucks or working down at the garment center or parking cars. I learned from my manager, Bob Redcross, that I had to build my new career step by step. Overnight success is great for the pocketbook, and that's what I had when I was 13. But what have you got when it goes? What happens to you as an individual? A lot had happened to Frankie, but he didn't give up, and he seemed determined to recapture the fame he once had, and anyone attending his shows were sure to be entertained from the opening number until the end. In fact, he was so talented that he was billed as Mr. Talent, Frankie Lymon. I performed in nightclubs in every major city in the United States and in clubs and theaters in Iceland, South America, London, Spain, Italy, and France. I sing in many languages: French, Italian, Spanish, Hebrew, Portuguese, and of course English. No, I don't speak these languages, I just sing in them. I learned the words phonetically. Frankie also played the drums, the alto saxophone, the vibraphone, and he also tap danced. With the talent he possessed, it's easy to see why he was given the name Mr. Talent, but as amazing as his live shows were, his records weren't really selling. This in part was due to the fact that the public was used to his younger voice, Elizabeth Waters. He started singing in different languages, tap dancing, doing various things so that he could make a show, but he just couldn't get back on top like he was when he was younger and his voice was high. So I think that was his problem. In 1964, Frankie released the songs To Each His Own and Teacher Teacher on 20th Century Fox and Sweet and Lovely and Somewhere on Columbia. One music critic had this to say about Sweet and Lovely. Frankie Lymon has also been reviving an oldie. Sweet and Lovely is the tune, but it's doubtful whether Grandad will remember the original after listening to Frankie's effort. Taking full liberties with the lyrics and even more with the beat, the tune has been updated to today's teen standards and should do well on the hit parade. Frankie shows excellent voice qualities and good phrasing. But neither that song nor any of the songs he released that year were hits. Frankie Lymon. What makes a hit record? Well, if I could come up with the answer to that, I'd be a millionaire. You just can't figure the public. All you can do is keep trying with a bit of this and a bit of that. If something clicks, you hang on to it until they tire of it, which is soon. I'm lucky, though. I'm adaptable and flexible. Unlike many other performers who have a set style, I have the ability to change with the times. What the public wants at the time, I try to give it to them. On stage, he certainly did. And in 1965, he was still getting gigs. But his drug addiction was getting worse, and lots of people didn't want to work with him as a result. So not having much work on the East Coast, Frankie flew out to California and got with Zola, who helped him get some gigs, the biggest one being Hollywood A Go-Go. This was Frankie's first television appearance in a while, so this would have been the perfect time to showcase his voice, as well as some of his many other talents. But instead, he lip-synced his songs, Little Bitty Pretty One, and Why Do Fools Fall in Love. Not long after the Hollywood A Go-Go performance, it was reported that Frankie and Zola had gotten married in Las Vegas, and they had announced their plans to become a duo, and it looked like they were close to signing a recording contract with Columbia Records. For Frankie, this would have been the kind of breakthrough he desperately needed to revive his career. If done right, this could have helped restore his reputation. But before the couple would embark on their journey as a duo, Zola was set to go to Japan to tour with the Platters, But before she left, something unexpected happened. Frankie had been complaining of intense abdominal pains, so she contacted a doctor who told her to give Frankie a couple of pain pills. She then said he became dopey after taking 4 of the pills, so he walked through the house repeatedly, but it didn't help, so she rushed him to the hospital. After examination, it was revealed that Frankie was suffering from acute appendicitis, so he had to have surgery. After having the operation, Frankie was unable to go with Zola to Japan, and he couldn't make the long trip back to New York either. So Zola left him at her house and instructed him to pay the bills with money that would be forwarded to him through her attorney. This would turn out to be a huge mistake. Instead of focusing on his recovery or working on ideas for he and Zola's act, Frankie, who was still at the time struggling with addiction, had other plans for Zola's money. And when she returned in April of 1966, her house was in foreclosure, and Frankie had gone back to New York and told his wife, Elizabeth, and others that his marriage to Zola was just a publicity stunt. Zola Taylor. I'd have killed him, I was so angry, but I couldn't get my hands on him. I couldn't find him. Zola would also say that the marriage wasn't real, claiming it was just a joke that she went along with. Zola Taylor. The only real thing we had in common was our mutual love for show business. She was furious, and rightfully so, but she still had love and empathy for Frankie. Zola Taylor. I think he was as honest as he could be with anyone because he was sick. And she also said, I'm not a person to hold a grudge. I feel sorry for him most of all. If you have any kind of heart at all, you know that he went through hell. What could have been a new chapter in both of their careers never came to be. Despite the talk of joining forces as a duo, Frankie Lymon and Zola Taylor never took that next step together. Instead, their lives and legacies went down separate paths. The promise of that collaboration remains a what if, left to the imagination of fans who wondered how their voices might have blended. In the end, Frankie and Zola are remembered not for what they almost did, but for what they gave the world. 2 distinct legacies that still echo through music history. If you enjoyed this video, please like, comment, share, and subscribe, and join us next time.